Happy Tuesday, friends. Today is Tuesday, August 29th, 2023, and I figured what better way to inspire you than to show you some beautiful quilts. This past weekend, I went to a quilt show hosted by the Stone House Quilt Guild in Manassas, Virginia, and today's video is just footage of some of the quilts that just caught my eye and had me completely sucked in. At the end of today's video, I do have a little bit of bonus footage to show you something that I picked up from one of the vendors that I thought was really cool. So you'll want to stick around to the end. All right, are you ready to see some quilts? Let's get started. This is the green jelly bean made by Susan Graves. She says this jelly roll was purchased about 4 or 5 years ago just because I love all the colors. You know how that is. Well, when we were challenged to produce a jelly roll quilt for the show, I happened upon this gem and said yes. This is the Unwilling Art Quilt made by Kathy Schumer. She writes, as a rule, I'm not drawn to doing art quilts. I saw these two panels in Arizona displayed as two separate quilts. I envisioned them sewn together and then quilted. Once I had it on my frame and was considering how I was going to quilt it, I decided that I would try my hand at thread painting. I did find the process cathartic and satisfying. I hope you enjoy looking at this quilt. After the show, it will be hanging in my kitchen. This is Lion Jungle Abstraction made by Kathy Taylor, and the artist didn't really write a lot about this quilt. She just said that it's a foundation paper piece pattern by Violet Craft and that she used the colors suggested by the pattern. My friend Donna over at Handmade by Ying has done several Violet Craft FPP patterns, and this quilt to me reminded me of her. This is Lancaster Wedding made by Beth Flores. She writes, my nephew and his wife were married in Lancaster, Pennsylvania in October 2020. I based this quilt on the Amish traditions of 4 large quilt blocks. I then researched and found that there is a Lancaster star, which I added to the middle of this quilt, and I quilted it all by myself. This is a really big quilt that measures 88 inches by 88 inches. The bright colors of this quilt absolutely had my jaw on the floor. This is called Synapse by Janelle Hansen. The pattern is from a book called Designing Tessellations by Ginny Beyer from 1999. Tessellations are designs that interlock and repeat across a surface. This process of designing tessellations intrigued me, and though it was complicated, it was a fun challenge. I decided on this pattern, which was an example in her book on page 175. I changed it by creating bright centers and darker outer edges. It reminded me of cells and nerve impulses traveling between cells called synapses. I really loved this quilt. Honestly, it was probably one of my favorites. This is the Zoo Family Portrait made by Kathy Taylor. It is an FPP design from Debbie and Stitch, and she used the colors that were suggested by the pattern. She says the quilt belongs to her grandson James, who very graciously loaned it to her for the quilt show, and the design is by the Not So Dramatic Life. This is the Spring Tide sampler made by Brenda Bauman. She writes, I won a kit on Instagram to make the Spring Tide sampler quilt. 12 designers each designed a block. I made all 12 blocks during the quilt along. I bought more fabric and decided to make a 25 block quilt. I added 6 borders, including a scrappy border, and I quilted it with My Creative Stitches Flower Powers cousin design. This is another submission by Kathy Taylor. This is Elephant Abstraction, and it is another FPP pattern from Violet Craft using the colors suggested by the pattern. This is that gorgeous elephant that Donna led a sew along for over on her channel. This is honestly something that's been on my bucket list for a while, and I admire seeing this quilt anytime anyone does it in any colorway. Oh my goodness, are these little penguins just absolutely adorable? This is called The Penguins, and it's made by Claudia Sanchez. She writes, I fell in love with the smallest penguins in the world when I visited Australia several years ago. I saw this pattern in a Simply Modern magazine at Mary's Retreat Center in Bedford, Pennsylvania, and I just knew this was going to be my first quilt. I started working on it at the Cape and Springs Retreat in September 2021. The upside down penguin represents that it's okay to be different. The pattern is The Big Chill by Sherry Noel. Did your jaw just hit the floor? Because mine did. This is called Eureka, and it's made by Donna Hoover, and it is ginormous. It measures 87 inches by 105 inches. She writes, Eureka, the name reflects how I felt when I finally finished this quilt. I purchased the pattern around 2008 at a quilt show in Hershey, Pennsylvania. I loved the design and the pattern colors. It was sage green and plum. Then life got in the way of making it. Unknown to me, a quilting friend had purchased the same pattern and was doing it in a black, red, and white combination, and I fell in love with her palette. Once I finally got started, it took me a year to piece the queen size version, 2 days to quilt it, and almost a week to hand finish the binding. I was thrilled when I was awarded a first place blue ribbon at the Elizabethtown Fair in 2021. It's one of my favorite quilts. The pattern is Eureka by Jackie Robinson for Anima's Quilts Publishing. This is called Snowflake and it's made by Susan Sanders. She writes, I always wanted to make a Bargello quilt, and when I found out Elaine Stuckey was teaching this class at Berger's, I signed right up. It was originally supposed to be a tree skirt, but I decided to close up the middle and just make it into a hexagon quilt. It was a fun class, and I am glad Elaine was there to guide all of us since the instructions were not the easiest to understand. I am looking forward to hanging it up this Christmas. The pattern is called Bargello Holiday Tree Skirt by Martha Eady. Na 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 Batman. This quilt is called Batman and it's made by Brenda Bauman. She writes, I made this Batman quilt using a vintage Batman panel and I added Lemoyne stars around it with 5-inch squares. I added a scrappy border and it was custom quilted by my friend with the words BAM, KAPOW, and ZAP with the Gotham City outline. I love all of the texture that is done in this quilt. I can't get over how much the quilting on this particular quilt really brings it to life. This is Soar, made by Beth Flores. She says that Soar is a wedding present for my brother and his wife. They will be married 10 years this September, and I finally finished their quilt. This pattern is loosely based on a pattern off of a Quilters Cash website, and I chose to do the quilt in batiks based on the original wedding colors. My brother is a big Philadelphia Eagles fan, and I quilted this myself using the Eagle Soar pattern. This is Winding Waters Amish Style by Debbie Wine. Debbie writes, after 4 years of taking these fabrics to retreats, this surprise from my husband finally came together. There are nearly 50 more blocks at home whose colors looked great in a stack, but not really once they were made into a block and then put on the design wall. Never has a quilt taken more out of me until I finished this project. It may now be one of my all-time favorites, and I hope my husband loves it as much as I do. Finally, after about 25 years of asking, Michael, here is your Amish quilt. This is the Circle of Life quilt made by Kathy Taylor. It is an FPP quilt that is designed by Jacqueline DeJong. She made this quilt because she took a workshop with Jacqueline DeJong and she used the colors that were suggested by the pattern. She says that the quilt belongs to her grandson Peter, who loaned it to her, and Peter uses it as a tent because the backing fabric is stars. I hope that Peter is using that as an indoor tent. This is Bear Paws in Indigo made by Susan Thacker. She says this quilt was created from a challenge from a bee friend. I used my stash of indigos that has been collected over the years, and I finally finished the quilt with the help of Buffy Harris's custom quilting. This is the Log Cabin Christian Cross made by Donna Hoover. She writes, I made this quilt in memory of and dedicated to my parents, Benjamin and Frances Funk. Until recently, it hung in the lobby of my church in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. The pattern is the Log Cabin Christian Cross by Judith Haju for Quilt Fox Designs. This is a badass quilt. No, really, that's the name of it. It's made by Susan Sanders, and she writes that the quilt started out as a charity quilt. Beth Flores and her mom Rita put together the fabrics and picked a pattern for the charity quilt. I was still getting back into quilting and really wanted someone just to tell me which fabrics to use where. They laughed when I told them this. So I did my best, and out of the fabrics that they gave to me, I decided which fabrics to use where, and I put the quilt together. I was thrilled with how good it turned out. Don loved it so much that I ended up buying it from the Guild silent auction and gave it to him for a Christmas present in 2022. The pattern is from Nancy Lacey. This is called All God's Children by Karen Jones, and it's a beautiful quilt. I love how it's worked up here. Unfortunately, Karen really didn't write much about the quilt, so I don't have a story to tell you, but she did say her grandkids love saying who is who among the cousins and friends, and this is her first time sewing curves. Personally, I love the colors that she picked in this quilt. I loved that rainbow border, and the quilting design of the hands across the entire quilt is really a nice touch. This is Wedding Knot by Susan Sanders. Susan writes, I made this quilt for my daughter, Christina, and her husband-to-be, Bill Mering. Christina likes two-tone quilts, and this was the second two-tone quilt that I've made for her. I started the quilt in 2017 and finally finished it in 2022. It was one of the most challenging quilts I have ever made because it was all quilted over so many years on 3 different machines in 2 different states, and while my husband was ill. Christina understood and said as long as I got it finished before their 5th wedding anniversary, I was good. And I did. I completed it and gave it to them on their 4th wedding anniversary. The pattern is Lover's Knot from Carpenter's Corners by Judith Haju. This is the 2013 President's Quilt made by Beth Flores. Beth writes that she was the president of the Stone House Quilters Guild in 2013. As a result, she was gifted all of these beautiful signed blocks from the members. She custom quilted this herself, and it is her absolute favorite quilt. I love how each of the blocks here are a friendship star, and in the center of the friendship star, she's got a small label that is signed by all the members. Gail Buchanan made this quilt called Good Friday. It measures 63 inches by 72 inches, and she said that the quilt reminds her of her son's and daughter-in-law's faith, and she gifted it to them in Christmas 2022. So what was that special find that I picked up at the quilt show? Spoiler alert, it actually wasn't this chair, although it was quite comfortable. There was a vendor at the quilt show that specialized in taking old treadle machines and turning them into functional furniture, and I fell in love with this desk. Once I realized that the treadle actually worked, I was absolutely hooked, and I brought it home. I even had my daughter try it because I thought this was the perfect solution for restless leg syndrome, and we kind of dubbed it our fidget desk. Ultimately, we decided to home the fidget desk in the family room, which allows all of us to make really good use of it. I think it adds the perfect workstation to a room that I already enjoy spending so much time in. Thank you, friends, for tuning into this week's video, and I'll see you guys next week.